Hello everybody, my name is Tim Gardner. I'm a Regulatory Affairs Manager at 3M, and today in the Worker Safety Best Practices series with ARTBA, I'm going to talk about optimizing worker visibility. When you talk about worker safety around visibility issues, you first have to think about U.S. regulations, and those come from the MUTCD. The MUTCD specifies that everybody will use PPE that is compliant to ANSI ISEA 107, High Visibility Consensus Standards. And mostly when you think about high visibility in workers, you think about a high visibility warning vest. Probably this sort of garment. Frequently used, we see them a lot of the time, but is it really the best solution? There's been a lot of science in the last 10 years or so that talks about that question, and we're going to review some of that in the presentation today. Three topics that we really have to talk about. The first one is compliance, because when you talk about compliance, it really dictates what your choices are or are not with respect to the use of PPE. What about among the choices that you have, how do you optimize the performance? And then finally, the third part of that is going to be discussing risk assessment. For U.S. worker visibility compliance, there is a timeline associated with this. Beginning in 1988 with a British standard, which was the first high visibility standard. That same standard was taken in about 5 years to be converted for use all over Europe in EN 471. Sometime later in 1999, we had the U.S. ANSI ISEA standard 107, which many of you know very well. And then several years after that, first U.S. regulations started to appear. And I believe the first regulation in 2002 was in some state OSHA documents, such as in my home state of Minnesota, and then also in some longshoremen regulations. And then finally, by 2005, in the U.S. Federal Highway Bill that was passed, Safety Lou, for the first time, there was some move towards federal rulemaking on regulations for the national level. Those came out in 2008 and 2009, so they would apply to all public roadways that are incorporated into the MUTCD. Now you see a last item on this timeline, and that is ISO 20471, and this is the draft of the International High Visibility Standard. The U.S. is really not on a track to be adopting the ISO standard. However, we like our own standards. However, some countries will adopt this, and because it was drafted under Vienna Agreement, Europe will adopt it if it is approved. The one thing I want to point out to you, though, is that it's 2012 at this point. The ISO standard is not yet approved. It might be approved in the next year or so, maybe a little bit more. But going back to 1988, we're well over 20 years that this thing has evolved. So this is kind of slow, and it's been working for a very long time. MUTCD requirements are worth reviewing. Essentially what it says is that if you are a worker, and a worker is broadly defined to include volunteers as well as paid employees who are present in the work zone, who are exposed to moving traffic hazards or moving machinery, other types of high visibility hazards, then the prescribed solution is ANSI ISEA 107 Class 2 or Class 3 garments. There are some other categories such as emergency and incident responders that have some other provisions in there that were necessary for the implementation of the regulation. But the bottom line is, if your crew or anyone connected to your operations works on or near the roadway or construction equipment, you need to have ANSI ISEA Class 2 or Class 3 garments. This is mandated in the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD, and is enforced by OSHA. Now, when a lot of people think of Class 2 or Class 3 garments, they really just think about one thing, and that's a common Class 2 vest. You've seen a lot of different variations. It's probably garments like this. Very well known. This particular garment is not compliant. So even though there might still be some of these kicking around, you can no longer be compliant to the prevailing regulations. This is an ANSI Class 2 vest, and it is more in line with the minimum requirements that you would have to see now. There's a lot of things that you have to think about with Class II vests. First of all, they are convenient. You just put them right on over your existing clothing. They are cost effective. You can buy vests really cheap if you want. Sometimes you get what you pay for. It might not necessarily be the most cost effective solution for you. And they are minimally compliant. So it's going to be your cheapest, easiest path to compliance. However, vests are also minimally performing, primarily because they constrain all of the high visibility materials, the fluorescent background material and the retroreflective material, to the torso. It is an entry-level garment. It is cheap and convenient, but it is also going to perform below the other kind of garments that you could choose. And it is minimally compliant, with the emphasis on minimal. There are some reasons why safety vests may not be worn as well. In 2002, the ISEA published a study, and basically what they found was that sometimes people don't wear high visibility vests because the employers don't enforce their use. If you don't have somebody, a safety officer or a supervisor, or even the workers themselves who are safety oriented, if there's a culture of safety, enforcing the use and saying, hey, this is part of our safety equipment, this is part of what keeps us safe on the job, then people would tend not to use them. Sometimes there's a lack of style or a lack of comfort. People don't like the way the garments work. They don't like the way the garments look. And if that's the case, sometimes they'd prefer just to leave them sitting there on the ground or in the vehicle. And in hot climates, either where it's very warm or you have a lot of humidity, asking a worker to put on another garment over the top of their existing clothing can be pretty hard. Having those multiple layers as opposed to a single garment where you have the high visibility built in can be a real comfort and performance penalty. Sometimes it does hamper job performance because it gets snagged or it gets in the way. People don't want to get sucked into machinery. It's easy to forget because it is a supplemental garment, and it can get soiled or torn. I think we've all seen examples of high visibility garments. This garment is probably well beyond the point at which it should be retired. One of the things that we need to talk about for optimizing visibility is something called the biomotion principle. And there's a website that you can go to, biomotionlab.ca, and when that screen comes up, you can see that there's sliders on there, and you can move those sliders around a little bit. You can move it a little more masculine, a little more feminine, a little lighter, a little heavier, a little more relaxed, a little more nervous, and it changes the characteristics of the outline that you're seeing. And it's not really a profile of a person. What you're seeing is key points of the body that are highlighted, and as those things move around, that's what we recognize. The idea of a profile of a person doesn't really mean a lot to us visually. We tend not to see things that way, but we do have a strong sensitivity to human motion. So if we use high visibility materials to emphasize that human motion, much the way this website does in the biomotion, then our high visibility actually is more effective. And this has been studied quite extensively over the last 10 years or so. Some of the important work in this area was done by a professor named Richard Terrell, who's at Clemson University in South Carolina. And one of his graduate students that did a lot of this work is Stacy Bach, who's over at the FHWA now. And the experiment that they did looked at a control group where you have a person just dressed in black, and you have observers trying to find that person just dressed in black. And obviously it wasn't very effective. But if you then take high visibility material, and this is a nighttime study, so we're talking about retroreflective material, and you put the retroreflective material on the chest of a person, or you take that same amount of material with the same photometric properties and the same amount of returned light, and you put it on other parts of the body, what do you end up seeing? What if you just put the material on the bottom of the legs? What if you put the material on the bottom of the legs and the end of the arms at the wrist? And what if you do it more like we talked about that biomotion pattern, where you mark the limbs and the ends of the limbs and the joints so that you have more of this sense of motion. And it turns out that even though all of these are returning the same amount of light, that if you emphasize the biomotion type pattern, it is far more effective. People detect and identify this as a person far more effectively than if you confine the material just to the torso. Now, the one thing here is that this obviously was a square of retroreflective material, or a rectangle on the chest, as opposed to being an ANSI type vest. Certainly the ANSI type vest might be a little better. Well, they also checked that out. And another scientist, this is Joanne Wood in Australia, published references at the bottom of the page, also found significant differences when you start adding material to different parts of the body. And her conclusion, again, was that if you have those kinds of materials at the ends of the limbs, they're going to be far more effective. A lot of these garments we're used to seeing. You know, we have high visibility vests. This actually isn't a vest because it has sleeves. A vest is a sleeveless garment. This is actually a Class 3 garment. This is a Class 3 garment. A Class 2 vest with no sleeves on it. Then we have a Class E garment, which is a set of pants that has high visibility material at the bottom, and it's made out of fluorescent background fabric. And then this would be part of a Class 3 ensemble when it's paired with a Class 2 vest. A lot of the Class 3 garments already have the biomotion built in, much like those pants do. And you can see the jackets in this slide have the stripes on the arms. You can also do this with a Class 2. There's nothing that really says that you can't put material on the sleeves if you have sleeves on a Class 2 garment. The bottom line for performance is that if you want things to work the best, you really want to mark the ends of the limbs. Class 3 designs include this as part of the requirements, but you can also do it with Class 2. If we get back to the MUTCD federal requirements again, there is an additional point in there that is often overlooked, and that is that a competent person is intended to conduct a risk hazard assessment for the work site. And when we're talking about optimizing high visibility material, this is principally going to mean choosing between ANSI 107 Class 2 or Class 3. That's really the choice you have to make. If you just go out and you do Class 2, you will be minimally compliant, but it may not be the best choice for your workers. In some cases, people will choose to go out and say, I'm just going to assign Class 3 to everybody on my work site. And that way, if there's any questions, I can just say, well, we put everybody in Class 3. We didn't have to give it any more thought. Ideally, you would give it a little bit more thought than that. And like I said, what OSHA likes to see is some evidence that you have put some rational effort into it, and maybe you go above and beyond. These are some accessories. They are not required by federal regulation. However, they do help. You see, if you have retroreflective material and high visibility fluorescent background fabric on your hands, it's going to be right in the right spot to give the maximum contribution to conspicuity. Likewise, on your head, if your head is bobbing around, it's much easier to identify that person. Other considerations in your hazard and risk assessment: traffic speed, proximity to that traffic, complexity of your background, the task load, the garment colors. In ANSI garments, we typically have lime yellow or fluorescent red-orange. And if you have yellow trucks, maybe you want to go with the orange garment. If you have orange trucks, maybe you want to go with the yellow garment. And depending on your background and the time of year and the kind of foliage that you have in your area and the color of the earth, one of these or the other may work better for you. There are competing hazards. There are things like arc flash, flame resistance, Maybe you need to have a certain kind of rainwear for a particular job. And typically there are other standards that stipulate those kinds of requirements, but they can be combined with high visibility within certain material sets if you need to specify that. There are also end-of-life issues for the garments. If you have a garment that's kind of at the end like this one is, some of the material may still be compliant on here. A lot of it probably would not. And then you can use the risk assessment as a way of maintaining tools and records so that you have something that you can point to, some process to your safety mechanism in your job site. And if OSHA comes in to do an audit or to do an interview, you have something that you can go to. And the ARTBA is quite supportive of this sort of thing, so stay tuned, and they may have something to help you out with this in the future. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and thanks for your attention.